Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. Please check out the link in the description to find out how you could gain access to premium content and social features. Hello Tolkien geeks, and welcome back to the Voice of Geekdom podcast. I'm your host Dan, and today's guest is Chris from the Philosopher's Games. Chris, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing very well. Very nice to be here. Always awesome talking to you about Tolkien stuff.
Definitely. This isn't your first time on the channel. You've been on for a live stream before. We've talked a bit on your channel before, but this is the first time you've been on for something pre-recorded. You and I talk about lore stuff quite a bit, actually. We've become quite good friends over the last year or so, and you're one of my go-to people when I've got a question. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to have a deep lore conversation with you about a very interesting character. We're here today to talk to you all about Elrond, the Lord of Rivendell. Elrond Halfelven, as he's often called as well. And so I was going to just ask you straight off the bat, just to get us going, what is it you find so interesting about Elrond? Because you've spent a lot of time over the last 6 months or so talking about Elrond, writing about Elrond, editing about Elrond, and creating epic videos about Elrond at the end of it all. The videos, Chris's videos on Elrond will be in the description below as well if you want to check those out. They're amazing. Why did you spend so long on him, and what do you find interesting about him, and what makes him compelling as a literary figure and interesting to read?
That's a very, very good and already complex question, I think, because Elrond, for once, is a character that has a lot of, I would say, facets. Hope I say this right. And he's like, in Lord of the Rings, he is like the scholar, the go-to guy. You go to this guy if you need advice. Like, everyone agrees on, yeah, let's meet at Elrond and Rivendell. And then there, everything, we get like a place where we can sleep, we get advice, we get food, we get drink. And we can then from there go on with this. So it's kind of a very interesting character just from the Lord of the Rings perspective, that everyone, even Gandalf, agrees, yeah, let's go to Rivendell. So something must be with this character. And if you look deeper into this character, you learn a lot of details about him, and also that there is, especially in Lord of the Rings, a really huge tragedy to this character. Mm-hmm. And that makes this character, in my opinion, insanely compelling and interesting. It seems like a very boring character. He's just a scholar and a healer, and he does everything well, and he knows everything, and he has a huge library and so on. And all the mighty and powerful people, even from Gondor, and even the dwarves, come to him for advice. Then, at the same time, there's also many other aspects that, so where are his weaknesses? That's also like a question asked in my video. And there's like a huge tragedy. He has to make really a lot of sacrifices throughout his life, and that for me makes this character so interesting and compelling, and became, well, getting deeper and deeper into Tolkien's lore, one of my favorite characters or side characters of this universe. And I always wanted to do a video about him, and as like a love letter to him, I decided to go very, very in a lot of detail, like very in depth into this topic, and start with his ancestors and also with all the different versions of him. And it's just so much to learn about this character. It's a very old character too. And yeah, very fascinating character that always fascinated me.
His ancestry is very interesting, I think. We'll describe that in more detail in a minute, but he's quite unique, I think, when you start to go into his ancestry, because there are other characters who are, diverse in their ancestry and their bloodlines, but Elrond and his brother, his twin brother by extension, are unique in that they literally have bloodlines from every major group from the First Age within their family mix, which I think is intentional on Tolkien's part and quite interesting, because he sort of represents the renewal at the end of the First Age in a way. We'll get into that more as we get into his story, but that's an interesting point to dwell on. And that was your first video about Elrond. You focused largely on all of his ancestors. I was joking to you the other week about that first video that I was listening to it, and halfway through I was thinking, is he going to talk about Elrond at some point here?
Yes.
So, but you can't escape that that's really important to him, and yes, and then when you get into his story, the tragedy as well. The other thing that I find really interesting and compelling about him as well is that he's quite a mysterious character. When shortly after we first meet him in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo kind of reflects on the fact that he's never seen Elrond before, although he's heard a lot about him, obviously from Bilbo and probably a little bit from Gandalf. And so he's heard a lot about him, and he thinks to himself, that the narrative says something along the lines of he had never seen the famous Elrond about whom so many stories had been told, or I think it's so many tales had been told. And you wonder what those tales are, you know. We know stories about him from the Silmarillion and so on, but you get the sense that there's untold stories there. There's a lot of room for that, actually.
Yes.
There is whole periods where we don't know that much about what he's up to. And at one point in the Council of Elrond, the question of Tom Bombadil comes up, because somebody at the council suggests that maybe they should take the ring back to Tom Bombadil, and Gandalf sort of shoots it down. And then later Elrond remarks on it, and he says, yes, I remember this Bombadil creature. I saw him years ago. And then he never tells you like what circumstances he encountered Tom Bombadil under. But apparently he hung out with Tom Bombadil at some point. And so there's got to be a story there. What happened?
Exactly.
So I like the mystery. I like the gaps in his history as much as I like the history, really. He first appears in The Hobbit in print, and he's quite a minor character in The Hobbit, really. As you say, he's kind of like the go-to guy for the dwarves to go and, you know, get some food and get some sleep and get some advice. And, you know, it's like, let's go to Elrond, man. He'll hook us up, kind of thing. At the same time that Tolkien was writing this, or around the same time, he was also writing his Atlantis myth, which is the downfall of Númenor, which was the precursor to the Akalabeth. And there's quite a complicated sort of chain of custody for this character in terms of how he came to be and how he was born into the Legendarium. So it was the Númenor storyline where I think probably where he first conceived of the character, arguably. Because there's two versions of the downfall of Númenor storyline, both of which are published in The Lost Road, which is volume 5 from the History of Middle-earth series. And so there's two versions. And in the first version, Elrond was an advisor to this character called Amroth, which is one of these names in Tolkien that's just been passed around through different characters. There's several different Amroths all over the place. It's just been a sort of hand-me-down name. But that character in this context, in this unpublished draft, was he was a precursor to Gil-galad. So he was basically the elven king in Middle-earth. And at this time, Beleriand still existed. So there was no destruction of Beleriand in this version of the mythology that I'm talking about. So really weird to think about, because it was just, you know, this is an alternate version. But this is where Elrond first was mentioned, as far as I'm aware. I think this was written before The Hobbit. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah. The first mentions I could find while I did research were like 1926, and I think he started writing in the early 30s with The Hobbit.
Yeah, so this downfall of Númenor storyline came about because of another book, which is The Lost Road, is a sort of novel that he came up with as part of a kind of bet with C.S. Lewis. And so The Lost Road was never finished, but he wrote 2 or 3 chapters of it, and it was kind of like a time travel storyline. And then he abandoned it because he sort of realized that what he really wanted to do was write his own version of the Atlantis myth. And so that's what the downfall of Númenor was. And so in the second version, he redrafted it. In the second version, Elrond was the character who was the first king of Númenor. And so if you know about Elrond, and you're listening to this, that probably sounds familiar because we're getting closer to the real story here, because Elrond's twin brother Elros in the canon version, if you want to use that word, was Elros was the first king of Númenor in the official version, but originally that role was for Elrond, so he was originally immortal at one point, which is fascinating. And then in the end, Tolkien kind of decides that he wants to have Elrond. Well, he put him in The Hobbit. And once he did that, he had to find a way to make that work when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. So that's when he invented the character of Elros and kind of had his cake and ate it as well, as we say in English.
Yeah.
He had it both ways.
I think Tolkien wrote somewhere that he just borrowed some characters that he has written before, and without much thinking put this character into The Hobbit, and this basically started the transformation of Elrond. So in the early version you mentioned from 1926, and the second version, where he is the first king of Númenor, it's very interesting that even there he was half-elven already, and his name was Elrond. His name was not much changed, actually not at all, and it's really fascinating. If you read that, even his ancestors, like he was the son of Elwing and so on. Even some of his ancestors are sometimes they're just moved around a little bit, but even his ancestors were already there. Like his story from this point on has not changed much. Only that he did not, or that there was suddenly later Elros who became the first king of Númenor, and Elrond, due to The Hobbit, became the Lord of Rivendell.
Yeah, and in that first version, where he's the advisor to Amroth, that's also similar to his to Elrond's real Second Age story.
Yeah,
so he kind of couldn't make up his mind, and then he had it both ways in the end, as I say. Just invented a twin brother. So this through a process of cell division, we got two characters instead of one, basically. And yeah, Tolkien does that so well, doesn't he? He just kind of he takes ideas and recycles them, and then retcons them later to make it all fit. And that's how we get a whole legendarium of stories.
If you read the Hobbit text, where you find the description of it, he's described as an elf friend, and it almost sounds like he still is considered to be among men or something. But some interpret this as a little leftover of his original version, where he decided to be as half-elven, to be counted among men and not among elves yet. But still, it's a really strange little detail when you read it. But I also think that the half-elven simply have a very specific status that Tolkien wanted to express here. But it's an interesting detail.
Yeah, the half-elven thing is kind of a metaphysical problem. I kind of phrased it as it being like a genetic thing. You know, when we started, I talked about his heritage and so on, but it's not really. It's not really a genetic problem. Like the half-elven, it's not like if you've got, you know, a certain percentage of elfish blood, you qualify as being half-elven. No, if you're a child of an elf and a man, then you're a half-elven, and because they serve different metaphysical purposes, as it were, in Ea, in Arda, there's a problem there, because you have to solve that problem. And so Eru kind of delegates this to the Valar to solve this problem, and then they give them the choice, basically. Interesting. Maybe I should get into the half-elven thing a bit more as we go through the storyline.
Yeah, probably. Because
it's probably best to sort of discuss that in the context of the storyline, I think. But I do want to actually start us out with talking about Elrond and Elros's heritage a little bit. So that's probably a good place to start with his storyline. They were the children of Elendil, who was the son of Tuor and Idril, and Elwing, who was the daughter of Dior and Nimloth. So if that sounds like a mouthful, it's fairly simple. Tuor was a mortal hero, and so he was part of the House of Hador. And Idril was a princess of Gondolin, so she was a Noldor. and Elwing was the daughter of Dior, as I say, and Dior was the son of Beren and Luthien. So we're already seeing, as I said, we're seeing different peoples and different cultures and different races in the grandparents of these two characters.
Yeah, maybe to add, the mother of Idril was also a Vanyar elf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she was what's her name? Elenwe,
I think.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And also on Turgon's side as well, if you go up his line as well, I think so Fingolfin's mother was Indis, so here there's also Vanyar blood further up as well. And then, of course, there's also the three houses of the Edain. So I mentioned Beren, he's from the house of Beor, and Tuor was from the house of Hador.
Hador.
Yeah, but there is also Haladin blood there as well, because Huor's mother, Huor is Tuor's father, his mother was Hareth of the Haladin. So there's all three houses of Edain there as well. So this is what makes these characters incredibly unique, because I can't think of another character that has a more diverse heritage than Elrond and Elros.
He's connected to basically every major group from the western lands and from Middle Earth and from Aman. So it is it's kind of it's a really fascinating detail, and it's, I don't know, there's just, I mean, the especially the line of his ancestors of men is really a complicated one. Like, there are so many people there that are somehow connected. I think the wife of Huor, Rian, was also somehow connected to the Haladin. Maybe I remember this wrong though, because it's like a really, really big family tree and so many names in it. You know very little about many of those, but yeah, it's really fascinating, and all comes basically together again when at this point, basically with Elrond and Elros. That is very, very interesting, and also, like, I found this detail always very interesting while speaking about the ancestors. I also talked a bit about this in my video, that there are a lot of twins in this line. Like, if we think, for example, of Dior, he also had two twin sons, and Elrond and Elros are twin sons, and Elrond's sons, also Eladan and Elrohir, later also twins. It's kind of interesting. Maybe that's just a theory of mine. The twins express a bit the, let's call it, duality of the men aspect and the elven aspect in this line. But like I said, just a wide theory here of mine.
No, I like it though. Yeah, it's interesting. We'll get into Elrond's children much later on, but it's interesting that he does have twins as well, because they appear to. I want to ask you this later on, and we'll get to it later. But they stay behind. They don't sail on the same ship as him, and as far as we know, they don't ever sail to Aman. Maybe they do, and we're just not told. Yeah. And Tolkien just doesn't tell us. But it's not like Tolkien to leave things out. So my assumption is that they stay in Middle Earth, which is interesting.
And tragic.
It is. Yeah. I think we'll get to that a bit later on, but Elrond's whole story is punctuated with a lot of tragedy, as you'd imagine from a character that was born right at the end of the First Age when everybody was dying left, right, and centre.
Exactly.
His father's story is kind of tragic. His parents, and so for those who don't know, his father, as we say, was Elendil, and he was the great sort of prophesied hero of the First Age who sought out the Valar, and then he sailed to Valinor and sought them out to kind of plea for their deliverance from Morgoth, who had taken over all of Beleriand and so on. And so he went there to seek them out and to seek their aid. And then he sails back he flies back on his flying ship in the War of Wrath. And so that was a very dramatic moment. He killed the dragon. But his eventual
the Black.
Yeah, his eventual fate, though, is to never be able to return to the lands that he loved. And so he sails across the sky, guarding the ramparts of the heavens, or something, I think is the phrase that the Silmarillion uses for the return of Morgoth. So he kind of guards the door of night.
Yeah. And you can see him as a star in the sky.
Yeah, which is really it's a really beautiful, poetic kind of myth of explanation.
Yeah.
But it's also really tragic because he's all alone, basically, and he can't. And he never sees his children again. And he originally takes the choice for himself to live the rest of his life as an elf because he wants to be with his wife, because his wife chooses the life of an elf. But it doesn't work out like that. So it's tragic.
Well, he can at least see us sometimes, because there's I forgot the name of the tower, though. They built a tower for his wife, Elwing, and she can, after this incident, turn into a bird and fly up to him, to his ship, and then they can meet. But still there's some condition. The fate of a mariner, you could say, now just sailing in the skies. It's an interesting, also a theme in Tolkien's writings that we find several times. We have two quite unrelated Aldarion and Erendis. The story in Aldarion is also always away and is sailing through the world, and his lover has to wait for him and it doesn't work out too well for them too. It's interesting that this is also kind of appears in several stories of Tolkien.
So then there's that whole event, and so the third kinslaying at the Havens of Sirion. What happens is that Elrond and Elros are 6 years old at this point. This is the year 538 of the First Age. And Elendil is away sailing at the time, but the sons of Feanor attack because they're trying to reclaim the Silmaril from Elrond's mother, who is Elwing, as we say. And what she does is she throws herself into the sea with the Silmaril to escape. And you would assume that this is a suicidal act, that she doesn't expect to survive. But she's rescued by Ulmo, who turns her into a bird, and the two of them, she flies away and she finds Elendil. And so then Elrond and Elros are orphaned, and they're captured by Maedhros and Maglor, who are the two eldest sons of Feanor. And so they take pity on them. I've got a quote here which describes the event from the Silmarillion, of the Voyage of Elendil and the War of Wrath, which is the final chapter of the Silmarillion. So if you haven't finished the Silmarillion yet and you're still watching this, maybe turn off now.
We'll come back later.
Yeah, so this is the quote. "Great was the sorrow of Elendil and Elwing for the ruin of the havens of Sirion and the captivity of their sons, and they feared that they would be slain. But it was not so. For Maglor took pity upon Elros and Elrond, and he cherished them, and love grew after between them, as little might be thought. But Maglor's heart was sick and weary with the burden of the dreadful oath." So I find that last line really interesting. Maglor he takes pity on them, and he cherished them, and love grew after between them. And so he became a real father figure to them. But his story is also bloody tragic. Yes. And what ends up happening is that Elrond and Elros are kind of double orphaned in the end, because they lose their foster dads as well. Because the Silmarils are recovered at the end. After Morgoth is defeated, the last two Silmarils are recovered by the host of the Valar. and they're placed under guard, but Maedhros and Maglor are still under the oath of Feanor. And so Maglor has wearied of the oath, but they're still compelled by the oath. And so Maedhros says, let's go and get the Silmarils. They're right there. Let's go and die in the attempt, because his argument is that the alternative would be worse. Basically, to not fulfill their oath would be worse. And Maglor kind of argues against it, but loses the argument and is persuaded by Maedhros to attack and steal the Silmarils. And so Eonwe lets them leave with the Silmarils, but they end up dying anyway. Maedhros commits suicide by volcano and jumps into a volcano with a Silmaril, and Maglor, he finds holding the Silmaril to be unbearable, and he throws it into the sea, and then he kind of disappears. And we're told that he kind of haunts the coastline as a kind of spirit of lamentation and so on. And so you assume that he kind of fades eventually, and he's no longer alive in the strictest sense, I would imagine. Maybe he was just drowned when Beleriand was already underwater, so I don't know which coastline this was, but yeah. In the quote that I just read out, the quote about Maglor's heart being sick and weary with the burden of the dreadful oath, is it that kind of change of heart that he almost has and then doesn't go through with? Is it just weariness of the oath, or do you think that Elrond and Elros and his love for them has something to do with it? Because I suspect that he's got something to live for at this point. I'm not a father myself. I can't imagine having children, but Maglor suddenly has children. He suddenly has something to care about again, beyond just the fulfillment of the oath. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think they are definitely onto something. What I also, in addition, could imagine in the second kinslaying, they were also, I think it was here not Maglor, there were also mentioned two other twins of J.R.R, which names I always forget, but it's not that important. And they were placed into the forest to starve, basically. And then I think it was here Maedhros thought, okay, that's not a good idea. He also suddenly repented from this decision, that maybe it's hard to say if he made it himself or others made it for him. And Elored and Elorin are the names. And he searched for them in the forest, but he could not find them. And so they were most likely died in the forest. And probably I could, because Maglor was also present at this, I could imagine that, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in the text, but I could imagine that this also had a slight impact on this. And then maybe, I mean, there was also, if you look at the timeline, a lot of hesitation after the second kinslaying before they attacked the Mouth of Therion in the third kinslaying. And I think they had some time to think and probably to look out for something. And this time in the third kinslaying, which basically is attacking a refuge camp, if you want, where just people fled after the war against Morgoth, and Morgoth is really on the winning side here already. And all big realms are destroyed, like Gondolin and Nargothrond and even Doriath and so on to an extent. And it's terrible. And as a result, they probably said, okay, in this time we can't kill the children. I think that might be something. Maybe Maglor saw a new opportunity in this to maybe have a different kind of them, having two children to care for, that he was pursuing. So yeah, I agree with your thoughts.
Okay, and so what happens next is basically the end of the First Age, and so with Elrond and Elros at this point, I think they're a bit older by the end of the Second Age. They're
around 50 something.
Yeah, they're about 50 or 60 at this point.
I think 58 is a number I've made, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, and so they are given the choice by the Valar on how they want to live their lives. Because as we said before, the half-elven they're a metaphysical problem to be solved at this point. And so they're given the choice themselves on whether to live a mortal or an immortal life. And so they make two different choices. I'm going to read the quote this is from the Acalabath. So this is relating more to Elros, but it is relevant for Elrond as well. This is from the Acalabath. And now Elros and Elrond, his brother, were descended from the three houses of the Edain, but in part also both from the Eldar and the Maiar, for Idril of Gondolin and Luthien, daughter of Melion, were their foremothers. The Valar indeed may not withdraw the gift of death, which comes to men from Ilúvatar, but in the matter of the half-elven, Ilúvatar gave to them the judgment, and they judged that to the sons of Eärendil should be given choice of their own destiny, and Elrond chose to remain with the firstborn, and to him the life of the firstborn was granted. So how does this work, Chris? This choosing whether or not to be mortal? Because are you immortal until you make the choice to be mortal? You know, do you have an unlimited amount of time to make that choice? Because that seems like you've got the best of both worlds there in a way. Or is there more to it than that? What are the mechanics?
Yeah, that's very complicated, and I think also split up among several books. Like I think also Nature of Middle-earth covers this quite a bit. And if you read into this, like there's really a lot to cover here. If you think we mentioned Dior and just his twin sons before, he was on paper also a half-elven, but he was never officially titled one because the ruling of the half-elven did not exist at his time, and he was slain in the second kinslaying. So what exact ruling applies to Dior is almost impossible to say, because his mother was elvish and his father was Beren, as a man too. And
yeah, where does his fire go when he is killed? Because he's
exactly.
killed. Who is he killed? We don't know who he's killed by, but he's killed during the second kinslaying when the sons of Feanor attacked Doriath. And so he just
slays a few.
Yeah, he kills a few of them as well. He takes some of them with him. God bless him. But where does he go? Does he go to he goes to the halls of Mandos, but where does he go after that? Does he get re-embodied, or does he? Because you still have to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is never really exactly answered. Interestingly, maybe he can make. There is like Beren also was in the halls of Mandos for some time, so maybe Dior could have brought to this decision there and say, do you want to be elf, then you get re-embodied, or do you want to be men, then you have to accept the gift of men and move on from here. Whatever that exactly means, it's a complicated topic, of course. And I think, it's really hard to say what he would have decided. Maybe he would have wanted to become an elf for his wife's sake, like, for example, Elendil did, also decided to be counted towards men for the sake of his wife, because she was also half-elf, interestingly, and had to make the same choice. And as a result, both became elves. And here it is now, it looks like it's really interesting. If we look into the timelines that in the life cycles, let's call it that way, of the elves, we see that usually to just get to adulthood, it takes a lot of time for an elf to even get there. Not potentially what physical growth is, but to develop their spirit and body to full fulfillment, or whatever you want to call it. That really takes. I'm not sure if you have the numbers in your head, but I think wasn't it 1,000 years or something.
You mentioned the Nature of Middle-earth. Of course, the first whole part of the Nature of Middle-earth, I've got it next to me here, the new Tolkien book. The whole first section is all about this question. It's how long does an elf take to mature, and how long do they live? Like how do they age? Basically, how does that process work? And Tolkien reinvented the wheel over and over and over again.
Yes.
Ad nauseum until he gave up.
Basically, yes.
If you read that first section of the book, you get the impression that Tolkien would have very much enjoyed spreadsheets.
Yes, pretty much.
Because he number crunches this over and over. So there's not really a definitive answer in a way.
But in some versions it takes a long time.
Yes, agreed.
And however, it's implied that the growth of a half-elven, that's just my interpretation, I want to word it very carefully, seems like they grow in the ways of men. Because if you think about it, an elven woman usually gets her first child very late in her life. That is different, for example, for Elwing, who was also half-elven, the mother of Elrond. She was around 26 when she gave birth to Elrond and Elros. And that is unthinkable for an elf. So there is definitely
but perfectly normal
opinion.
For a mortal woman, though.
Yes, exactly. So my understanding is basically that you have this time, and maybe your growth is as a half-elven closer to men at the beginning, and then you have to make the choice, and then the elf lifespan basically starts to switch over. However, there seems to be like a very undefined time. If we, for example, look at Arwen, who accepted the gift of men very late in her life. Like, how old was she there? 2000 something years.
I was going to ask you about this again later on when we get to her.
So, but you see, it's very complicated. It's really hard to give like a definitive. There's so much mystical and unknown about this to say, but I think at least in these early times, the Valar seems to push the people to make this decision very fast, like in the first, let's say, 50 to 100 years or something. Well, maybe later they got a bit more relaxed on this decision and said, yeah, just decide in 2000 years, whatever. And it's probably maybe like this, but it's just me theorizing here.
And so at this point in the story, when the Elrond and Elros, the two twin brothers, when they make this choice, it's never described to us what kind of conversation they have. You know, we don't get like a blow-by-blow account of their conversation discussing their choices, and we don't really get their reasons. You know, we know that Elros goes on to become a king of men, and that's the way that his life develops. But I don't know whether he makes that choice in order to lead men. I mean, that makes sense to me that he would make that choice because he wants to lead the remnants of the Edain, and that's why he chooses that choice. But why do you think Elrond chooses to move away from that and to live a life of an elf? Why do you think he makes that choice?
That's a really interesting question. I think, I don't know, if I think, for example, of his father, Elendil, and he was like a person who did things. Like, he was not hiding, he was not waiting a lot, he was not studying, was building his ship and was sailing. And if he comes back or not was not clear, but he just did his thing. And he lived in a way like a man. Maybe Elrond was in that regard, Elros was maybe similar, and Elrond was in that regard maybe a bit different. And it also fits his later character as a scholar. He wants to see everything, to study everything, to learn everything, to understand, maybe also to try to heal the world as a healer later. I think simply his character and his properties, or his, how you want to call it, what makes him Elrond resonated more with being an elf compared to probably to this hasty life doing things of men. It's not like that Elrond did nothing, but
hasty life of living for 5 centuries.
Yeah. And it also adds, of course, as like very fascinating book, often mentioned in the last few streams I was on, always coming back to Morgoth's Ring and the dialogue between Andres and Finrod and the tale of Adanel and so on, about the fall of men, basically. And they discuss also that for elves, it is also kind of weird to know we don't live on paper, we live forever, but we are bound to Arda. When Arda stops existing, what happens with us? nobody knows. And that's also kind of like a doomsday for the elves that they are kind of afraid of, and that men can't really understand. And so Finrod almost says, I would maybe also like the gift of men more than our fate, because it's also kind of weird. At least there is a fate for you, and for us, there is basically an end when the world ends. Mm-hmm. That is or maybe we have to hope for the mercy of Eru there. And that's a very interesting thought. I always ask myself a bit, after reading this, I read this like a few months ago again, was this very clear in the while making the decision of Elrond and Elros and also Elendil and Elwing and so on? Did they really know that this might be the fate? Like, it's here in this dialogue between Andres is of course of men, and Finrod, the brother of Galadriel, is an elf. They discuss their fates basically in this interesting dialogue, and it's very philosophical dialogue. And it's kind of interesting if this was also aware. Did in this case, of course, the Valar and Maiar could have explained it to them, and they probably give more context. It's hard to say how this might have been for others, but it's a very, very it's a topic of its own. It's a huge topic, I think.
And so, in another sad realization here about Elrond's life, it seems unlikely that he and Elros ever met again after Elros left for Númenor. Mm-hmm. He establishes Númenor, I think, the year 32 of the Second Age, if I remember correctly. And and so we know for a fact that nobody sailed back to Middle-earth until after Elros is dead, because that was, I think, around the year 700, something like that. As I forget the guy's name, but there's a guy who's mentioned in the Aldarion and Durendis, 600, who was the sailor, Viantor, that's his name, Viantor.
Viantor.
He was the guy who first sailed back to Middle-earth. So this was over 100 years after Elros had died. So for them to have met again at some point, Elrond would have had to have visited Númenor, which seems unlikely. And you and I have had this conversation about Galadriel before, about elves visiting Númenor.
Yes.
It seems unlikely that would happen, although it's not impossible.
At least for Middle-earth. It seems unlikely that this would happen. There's a very beautiful artwork of Jenny Dolphin that illustrates this, even though a bit over the top, where we see the old Elros and the
another one,
the elven Elrond, the elf Elrond, and they shake hands in a very it's a very touching picture, very cool picture in my opinion. Fantastic artwork. And there's a lot of tragedy. It was clear that when they now separate and go their ways, one becomes the king of Númenor, one becomes, let's say, the advisor or one of the advisors of High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, that they would never see again. And even after their death, probably they would not see again in a worst case scenario, if you want. So it's definitely a very heavy decision here to make.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Considering how they grew up, like they were basically probably they thought for a time that their parents were killed, and then they were taken away by the murderers of their parents, even though they did not kill their parents. But of course, this could have thought to come up, and they also killed a lot of people they knew probably in the third kin slaying, and it's really very tragic, like very unusual, I think. And now they only have as a family each other, and now they have to separate again forever.
All right, so let's get into the Second Age, and we'll leave Elros alone for now, because he's no longer particularly relevant. We'll stick to Elrond from this point. So in the Second Age, Gil-galad sets up the kingdom of Lindon in the remnants of what is left of Beleriand, basically, which is the area left or to the west of the Blue Mountains. So on your Middle-earth map, you've got the Blue Mountains there along the west coast to the west of the Shire. And that is all that remains of Beleriand, the lands of the first age of the Quenta-Silmarillion. And so that was Osiriand in the Silmarillion, which is basically Sindarin, and then the Quenya name for it is Lindon. So it's the same name actually. And so Lindon is Gil-galad's kingdom, and as Chris, you already said, Elrond becomes his kind of right-hand man, his de facto advisor and his helper there. He's got Círdan there as well, and Celeborn and others, but Elrond is very much, his main advisor, you would think. And then there's a long period where we don't know anything about what Elrond's doing, really.
Yeah.
Because there's a period of peace at the start of the Second Age. The elves think that Morgoth has been defeated, so evil has been defeated, I think, at this point. For a long time anyway, for several centuries. And then there's this kind of growing shadow that grows in the east, and so Gil-galad kind of realizes that no, actually there's somebody out there who's still causing a ruckus, causing trouble. And so he sends that letter to Aldarion's dad, for instance, which clearly shows that he's worried about what might be happening. And he doesn't know what the problem is, but he knows that there's a problem growing. And so Sauron eventually does reveal himself, but when he comes to Lindon in the year 1200 of the Second Age, so bear in mind this is, there's nothing that's happened much in that whole time, but when he does come to Lindon in his guise as Annatar, who I assume he still calls himself Annatar when he comes to Lindon. You more think of that name when he comes to Eregion later on, but he's turned away by Gil-galad and Elrond, who think that there's something very suspect about him. They don't know that he's Sauron. They don't figure it out quite, but they don't trust him, and so they wisely turn him away. So I'm going to read now from the Silmarillion, from the final story part of the Silmarillion, which is of the Rings of Power under the Third Age, which I'll be quoting from a few more times. So this is referring to Sauron and what's going on with him in the Second Age. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth, but long he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew that the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon he did not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware, for Sauron took to himself the name of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them, Alas, for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither, as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? Weird grammar there at the end of that quote.
Yeah, sometimes I also get caught by Tolkien's phrasing.
Yeah, it's sort of archaic grammar, which those have who are beyond the sea. It's just like, okay then, let's just go with that.
Sounds pretty German in a way.
Yes, yeah, you're not wrong. So So that I love that section from Sauron at the end.
Yeah,
I had to read that out. You can imagine him making that same argument to Elrond and Gil-galad, can't you? And I have this like image in my head of them looking at each other and just being like, "I'm not buying what this guy's selling."
This guy is kind of sus.
Yeah. So
But
yeah, really cool moment, and you have to love the kind of
I love this quote.
The wisdom of Elrond and Gil-galad sending him away, and sending messengers out to other peoples as well, warning that there's this snake oil salesman coming around trying to give away jewelry.
Yeah, that's such a cool detail, in my opinion, that Sauron approaches them and they don't let him enter. They hear what he or his messenger has to say and send him away. And then they immediately, I assume, react and send messages to their allies and say, "Hey, there's this weird Anatar guy going around. Probably don't trust that one. There's something fishy about him." And it's really a fascinating detail, and shows basically like the grandmother Idril was also known for her foresight, and Elrond also is later known for his foresight and makes even some prophecies here and there later. We probably come to that. And it is, here it clearly shows, in my opinion, and even though he cannot foresee who that person is, which also shows how powerful this disguise must have been, that these elves could not see through it and uncover it. Not even, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but he also goes, as you hinted at, to Eregion, and they could also, like, we have Celebrimbor, we have Celeborn, we have Galadriel, and all three of them could not see through his disguise, which just shows that this was kind of powerful. And there's also in the Nature of Middle-earth book a text that hints that Sauron really had to commit to this disguise. He could not just wander back and forth between Mordor and change his forms, as we sometimes imagine, but he really had to stay in this disguise for a time to really, nobody gets suspicious there. He had to be very patient, and it's kind of interesting. There were like rogue orcs in the east, and he couldn't basically bring them under his control while having this disguise, and so on and so forth. Some interesting details exist that expand on this.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really interesting. Thanks. Yeah, for me, I like the bit in Sauron's speech there where he talks about wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet he's kind of it's rhetoric that he's doing there, isn't it? Basically,
yeah, it really is.
He's building up his rhetorical enemy, but he's praising them. He's saying how wonderful they are, and then he's saying, but could it be that perhaps that they're just looking out for themselves, and he's turning people against each other, which
I really like how this is worded.
At this point, he's addressing. You imagine he's addressing the elves of Eregion at this point. And so
I think this is also the first mention of Elrond being a loremaster. Like at this point in time, he's just round about 1,200 years old or something, around that lines, maybe 1,500 in some versions. And he's just a very young elf, and still he's now considered a wise loremaster. That Sauron even praises.
That's still a lot of time to read books, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that is true. It's still a lot of time.
You can read and probably memorize the complete works of Pengeloth in that time. And elves didn't really write very much. I mentioned Pengeloth because he's the other one that comes to mind as a kind of loremaster. And there are a few others, but they weren't really. They were a culture that was all about oral history, especially in the First Age. And you don't get the impression that they wrote a lot of things down because they didn't need to. They have kind of perfect recall. They have a perfect memory anyway. So, and they're long lived. So why would they need to write things down that much? So they don't tend to.
And in addition, also, in case of Elrond, as we explained at the beginning or discussed, he is related to so many people. He just has to learn his family history. He knows basically all the important things.
True. the next step for Sauron was the forging of the Rings of Power, which began in the year 1500. And so this was Celebrimbor. I have another podcast about him if you want to check that out, with Helen, the Clueless Fangirl. And so Annatar and Celebrimbor kind of collaborate and start creating the Rings of Power. In 1590, Celebrimbor secretly, without Sauron's knowledge, forges the 3 Elven Rings. And then Sauron reveals himself. He forges the 1 ring. Celebrimbor discovers his deception, and so on. None of this really relates to Elrond, except for the 3 Elven Rings, is what I want to focus on here. So during the War of Elves and Sauron, which began in the year 1693 of the Second Age, the 3 rings are hidden. Galadriel kind of, Celebrimbor goes to Galadriel for advice here, and she says to him, we've got to hide these rings. We've got to keep them safe and take them off. Critically, most importantly, take them off.
Most importantly, take them off.
And so that's what happens. And so they're given away. So Celebrimbor luckily has the wisdom to give them away. So one goes to Gil-galad, Elrond's boss. One goes to Círdan, who is also in the same region. He's based there in Mithlond, which is right there in Lindon as well. And the third goes to Galadriel. So Gil-galad gets Vilja, which, if you know your Lord of the Rings, is the ring that Elrond eventually gets. I say eventually, it's not that much later. Gil-galad doesn't have it for very long. So the War of Elves and Sauron is pretty cool, and Elrond does some awesome stuff in this. 2 years after that, Elrond was sent to Eregion with a force of elves from Lindon to oppose Sauron and kind of try to, liberate Eregion, because Eregion is kind of besieged at this point, and he's sort of taken it over. Sauron's basically overrun the Noldor there. And so he joins up with an army led by Celeborn, but Sauron defeats them and keeps them at bay. And then finally, Eregion is sacked and Celebrimbor is killed. He's tortured to death. Again, as I say, we talked about Celebrimbor at length in another podcast. He's impaled on a spike and everything else. And then Elrond flees to the north, and a little bit further north of there, he establishes Rivendell, Imladris. So that was when that happened.
That is some very interesting details in these events. First, for example, to escape, there's a version where it is mentioned that the dwarves from Moria, I think even together with the elf from Lothlorien, through the doors of Durin, attack the gate, the east gate of Moria. The doors where the riddle is, we know from Lord of the Rings, and attack the rear of Sauron. And as a result, in this, they cannot overwhelm Elrond and potentially Celeborn's forces, and they can retreat. So there's a very interesting connection, in my opinion, in this detail. We can also read that when Celebrimbor went to Galadriel and sought advice, they could not find the strength to destroy the rings. That is also, in my opinion, a very interesting detail. That so the rings were just still around, then they sent them away. It's just, there's so many little details.
Remember that fact when we come to Isildur later on. Because there's a little bit of irony there, isn't there, in a way?
Definitely. There's definitely a bit of irony. Like, I really like how Tolkien managed to connect with little just sentences almost so many things so well. It's just always like, it's a very complex web of connected points. Like later Elrond helps the dwarves and always had like an open door for them. And maybe he did not forget that they once basically helped him out a bit by attacking also Sauron's rear there and let him escape in this. And then the place of opportunities, Rivendell, was founded like in this war, and Sauron put a force there to keep Elrond there at bay, which is also a very interesting detail, which weakens his main force a little bit. So a lot of small details here. Like if he would have overwhelmed the forces of Elrond and destroyed him completely, then his forces were probably much, much stronger if the dwarves would not have intervened. So there are just so many little details here that just changed the outcome later of the war tiny bit, like by a bit of time here and there.
I can't imagine Celeborn was fond of being rescued by the dwarves.
Yeah, I can't.
It's interesting to think of Rivendell being founded as a kind of military outpost in a way as well, because that's not how we think of Rivendell at all. It's the homely house. It's a pleasant little, kind of villa in the mountains, and there's this beautiful valley, and there's these waterfalls and everything. But it was a military base for a short while, and it was. I don't think when they established it there, it was ever supposed to be, a new elven stronghold. I don't think that was the idea at first, but that's what it turned into.
Exactly. It's interesting. I think in the War of the Last Alliance, it again gets a little military touch again, because the Last Alliance is stationed there for a while and prepares. But it's really fascinating. You say, I don't know, diamonds are created in pressure or something. I'm not sure how the English phrase exactly is worded, but definitely under the pressure there of the war, a diamond was created in that region.
Rivendell was completely besieged by Sauron, who was invading all of Eriador. But in the end, the elves were rescued by the elves of Lindon, who were led by Gil-galad, and with an allied force of men from Númenor, led by a man called J.R.R, which was during the reign of Tar Minister of Númenor. And so the Númenorians show up and save the elves in the end. And so they defeat Sauron, and he is driven back across the Misty Mountains into the east again. And so they managed to keep the 3 elven rings. But at this point, Gil-galad decides to give up his ring for reasons unknown. So this is Vilya. This is the ring of air. Yeah. So it's a blue sapphire stone with a gold band. And so Elrond takes this ring, and he takes it up and he starts using it, and he keeps it there in Rivendell, which I find is a good idea, because it's a good plan, because you have to think, if you're keeping these rings secret, and it's not a particularly well-kept secret, you have to say, but if you are keeping these rings secret, you don't give them to like the High King of all the elves, So Gil-galad giving the ring up, I think, does make kind of strategic sense in that way.
Yeah.
Don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree. It might definitely. I mean, there are different versions, a little bit of when the ring was given where, especially to Círdan and so on and so forth. But I also really like the idea. There's like in the Unfinished Tales, we find a version where they have like this after the war, the I don't know, the proto-White Council, if you want to call it like that. Mm-hmm. And they meet, I assume, in Rivendell, because we can read that Galadriel and also goes to Rivendell, I think also with her daughter Celebrian, and that potentially is where Elrond sees Celebrian, his future wife, the first time.
I think you're right, yeah.
And there it is decided that Eregion is not rebuilt, and that Rivendell basically becomes the new realm, or second realm in this region, and also guards the pass over the Misty Mountains. Mm-hmm. And there he becomes vice regent of Gil-galad. Before that, he was the herald of Gil-galad. It's basically, I assume, something like a diplomat, I would say, with some other functions in addition to, and now becomes vice regent. So I always imagine this like he's the heir of Gil-galad now, and also gets the ring here, which is really a fascinating detail, and decide how to continue and hope that. But they know, of course, that the evil is not defeated. Sauron did not get the 3 rings, but he get 16 rings. Plus the 1, and which he still keeps. And as a result, it was, even though Sauron was defeated and escaped narrowly in the end, thanks to Númenor, he still had a very good position. Like Eriador was completely destroyed. People lost their homes and had to flee back and forth and so on. Some also, I think, fled to Rivendell in this time and tried to.
Yeah, some of the survivors of Eregion end up in Rivendell as well.
Yeah, sure. And so there's definitely a lot of chaos of this time, a lot of need to rebuild. And Sauron was pretty close to defeating the elves too, and Númenor was delayed, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was a dire situation. The people were in, and was not like, okay, we defeated Sauron, and now we rule here for the next 5,000 years without contest. It was like, okay, we almost we barely escaped the absolute destruction, and now we have to rebuild, and our enemy maybe got a bloody nose, but he has to, or I'm not sure what the English phrase is again, but yeah, he escaped, but he's still in a good position and he can return anytime.
Yeah, Sauron definitely didn't, it wasn't exactly a loss. I mean, he was driven back, but he definitely did a lot more damage to them than they did to him, I think, too, as well. I wanted to ask you, because this seems like a good place to ask it. This is when Elrond takes up the ring. How does he use it? What does he do with it exactly? What's your impression of this? Because he takes the ring. Vilya, I think, somewhere in the lore was said to have been the most powerful of the three rings. Yes. It might even be at the end of the Lord of the Rings, I think it's mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's even Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. So it's the most powerful one, but we don't really get a sense of what he does with it. I mean, we know what Gandalf does with his when he gets his. He uses it to inspire hope in people and so on. We kind of know what Galadriel does with hers. She uses it to preserve the realm of Lothlorien and to keep it beautiful and keep it sort of timeless, I suppose. Elrond, I think, probably does something similar to her, but different in a way as well. And I'm not sure in what way it's different. I don't know how to put that into words. But I do get the impression that Rivendell is a different sort of place to Lothlorien.
Yeah, definitely. But I agree with you. I think he does something very similar to Galadriel. He establishes his realm and tries to preserve it. And he says in the Council of Elrond later that the three rings had a different purpose: to preserve, to heal, and basically keep things unstained. And I think the healing aspect is probably very important. He maybe, because Eriador, I think, has a very big amount of peace after this war, if I'm not totally mistaken. And in this time, maybe he uses his ring. That's how I imagine it, but it's just my theory, to heal not only Rivendell and make it beautiful and a special place, but also the surroundings and the people who, because we can also assume that a lot of wounded were there, a lot of people were hurt, lost their homes, and there were a lot of trouble. So he tried to heal those people. Maybe that's how I imagine. Maybe this is also, but as I said, it's never explicitly stated, the origin of Elrond as a healer, kind of. And I could imagine that this might be what he does with the ring. It's also kind of ironic that he gets Vilya, because if you look at the three elven rings, we have the ring of air, we have the ring of fire, and the ring of water. And this also is very reminiscent to the Silmarils, that also end up one in the sky, one in the water, one in a fiery pit under the earth. And so we have these elements that are reflected by it. And interestingly, his father is in the sky having the Silmaril, so he has the ring of air that makes a lot of sense in my book. I really like this little detail here.
Yeah, me too. I like that too. I've mentioned that parallel several times in different places. It's not very often referred to as the ring of air, it has to be said, but that is one of its names. So the next big event on the timeline, I would say, is the formation of the last alliance of elves and men. So let's get into that a little bit. How does that come about? It's the invasion of Minas Ithil that basically causes that, I think.
Yes.
And so Isildur ends up coming north to Arnor, and this was what precipitated Elendil basically coming to the elves and saying, we need to stand together against Sauron or we'll lose everything. This was in the year 3430. And then a year later, as you said earlier, they assembled in Rivendell and started building up their army for several years. I've got a quote here from Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, which I'm going to read. Now Elendil and Gil-galad took counsel together, for they perceived that Sauron would grow too strong and would overcome all his enemies one by one if they did not unite against him. Therefore they made that league, which is called the Last Alliance, and they marched east into Middle-earth, gathering a great host of elves and men, and they halted for a while at Imladris. It is said that the host that was there assembled was fairer and more splendid in arms than any that has been seen in Middle-earth, and none greater has been mustered since the host of the Valar went against Thangarodrim. So it's the greatest army that's ever been assembled since the War of Wrath, and none greater has been assembled ever since. Elrond says words to that effect in the Council of Elrond in the Lord of the Rings, isn't it?
I think the text might be related.
Yeah,
it's very it's very interesting that what is happening there. Like the detail, as you said, Minas Ithil is attacked by Sauron, and at this time around also the Nazgul are probably around 2251. So this is 30. Hard to say. And so yeah, even they could have been involved in. What I find very interesting, which I only noted while doing research for my video, if you think about it, there is also a Palantir in Minas Ithil, and I find the sword very interesting. What did happen with this Palantir? Did Sauron just not find it, or did Isildur take it with him? So or took it with him? We know that he escaped from there and also took a sapling of the White Tree with him, and he sailed up. I think we can read the Anduin for a time to get to Rivendell. So he went up the Misty Mountains in parallel and then north, and then went over the pass to Rivendell. So in my imagination, he took the Palantir with him. That would be the safest thing to do, in my opinion, instead of letting a powerful artifact like that for Sauron to have. And he later, interestingly, gets the Minas Ithil Palantir anyway. But the thought is very interesting.
I think you're right because of that fact. I think that's probably what did happen because of the fact that Minas Ithil was conquered twice.
Exactly.
So the second time was when Sauron probably took the Palantir, you would think, because obviously, like if Minas Ithil was taken the first time, and then the War of Last Alliance happens and Sauron's defeated for a while, then at that point you go and recover the Palantir, don't you, if it's gone missing?
Exactly. And that would, though, mean that the Palantir crossed, at least, and the sapling potentially Rivendell. That, I think, is a very interesting thought. Maybe, I think for fun, I said in my video, and basically Elrond had a Palantir in his backyard and a White Tree in his garden. Like, I think it's a kind of very funny because the family of Isildur was kept in Rivendell. His son, for example, his youngest son, just a small child at this point, and his wife stayed there, and his son grew up there for a time, which later we come to that probably is a tradition for the heirs of Isildur, if you want. It's I think it's a very funny and often overlooked detail, and quite interesting. Sorry for derailing your the timeline a little bit.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I found that interesting when I watched your video too. So yeah, I do appreciate that detail, and I'd never thought about that until you pointed that out. I wonder whether Tolkien had even thought about that. I'd be surprised if he actually did. Might be one of those things that he never really considered.
Yeah, that's why it's not explicitly mentioned, I guess. But in my opinion, just in my head canon, that is exactly how it happened.
Yeah, and it's kind of fun to think of him having a white tree in his garden as well.
Yeah,
it's sort of temporarily planted there just to keep it alive, and then move it again.
The original tree was burned again by Sauron because he's not a fan of these white trees, it seems. But Isildur always saves the trees. It's kind of his thing.
So then the War of Last Alliance gets into full swing. The armies march on Mordor, and Elrond fights in the Battle of Dagorlad. And the siege of Barad-dûr begins, and Sauron is defeated, and Isildur claims the ring. So we probably all kind of know this story, except I suppose some people might have the movie version in their head, which is a little different than the book version. Elrond is present for those events, but it plays out a little differently. I do have a quote here to back this up, which is a little bit of it's not too long. It's this is Elrond's recollection of Isildur claiming the One Ring from the Council of Elrond chapter. Yeah. So here we go. Isildur took it as should not have been. It should have been cast then into Orodruin's fire, nigh at hand where it was made. But few marked what Isildur did. He alone stood by his father in that last mortal contest, and by Gil-galad only Círdan stood, and I. But Isildur would not listen to our counsel. This I will have as weregild for my father and my brother, he said, and therefore whether we would or no, he took it to treasure it. But soon he was betrayed by it to his death, and so it is named in the north Isildur's bane. Yet death, maybe, was better than what else might have befallen him. Only to the north did these tidings come, and only to a few. Small wonder is it that you have not heard them, Boromir. For the ruin of the Gladden fields, where Isildur perished, 3 men only came back over the mountains after long wandering. One of these was Otar, the esquire of Isildur, who bore the shards of the sword of Elendil, and he brought them to Volondil, the heir of Isildur, who being but a child had remained here in Rivendell. But Narsil was broken and its light extinguished, and it has not yet been forged again. So that's Volondil, the heir of Isildur, who stayed behind in Rivendell.
The son that grew up in Rivendell.
Yeah. Aragorn at some points during the story actually refers to himself as being the heir of Volondil rather than the heir of Isildur. Sometimes he's the heir of Elendil as well, so he uses different terminology and different titles at different times. But this is quite an important figure, really, Volondil. As you say, he is kind of fostered in Rivendell for a while, which kind of foreshadows what happens later on with the chieftains of the Dunedain, really. And kind of starts that tradition in a way. Very interesting. I love the line, and this is why I like to point out that this is different from the movie. I love the line, "This I will have as a weregild for my father and my brother." I really enjoy that line. It's a much better line than "no" from the movie.
That is true.
I mean, that's a good moment in the movie. It works. But,
it's a really good moment.
But I really like this line. So, I was disappointed not to get it in the movie.
It would be cool if he instead of "no" would have just said "no, this I will have as a weregild." That would be made the improve the moment further. But I guess they had a very limited time budget for the prologue, and
they might have had audiences like looking for their dictionary as well, because we should probably explain what a weregild is. It's what it means is it's like a legal tradition whereby you're entitled to ask for. I'm not a lawyer, and certainly not a lawyer in the Middle Ages or the Medieval Ages. But a weregild is kind of it's a legal tradition where you're entitled to request some possessions in the event that it's
to compensate your losses.
Compensate your losses, essentially. Yeah.
It's really interesting phrase, and there's like, I don't know, there's a lot of little detail in this that shows that things are a bit different. Of course, Gil-galad and Elendil, the father of Isildur, fights against Sauron, and both also are slain in this process. We can read also on the Council of Elrond that Gil-galad is burned by the black hand of Sauron, something like this. It's implied, let's put it that way. It's weirdly phrased, or unusually. And the sword broke, but Sauron is also thrown down. And then we come here to this scene, and we can see that Isildur stood by his father, which is here explicitly mentioned, and Círdan and Elrond stood by the dead king Gil-galad. And then they had this conversation there. It's really fascinating. They probably did not went up to Mount Doom, to the cracks of Mount Doom, and had this conversation there. But I guess for the film it makes totally sense. I really love how Hugo Weaving delivers this Isildur. It's such an awesome moment, I think. Yeah.
They have to introduce that location as well, don't they? Because
exactly
that's where we're going. So that's, they have to show that at the beginning.
Exactly.
Does make cinematic sense, but I just do like this version too. This was all said to Boromir, who in the Council of Elrond was being a little bit of a troll and asking a lot of awkward questions. We'll get to the Council of Elrond much later, but it's a nice recollection that Elrond gives us of this moment, I think.
Yeah, really.
And so Gil-galad, obviously, his boss was killed as well, we should say, during this whole period, which means that Elrond, at this point, we said earlier, he was made the vice regent of Gil-galad's kingdom, which I'm not quite sure what that means in real world terms. I've never heard of that term other than in Tolkien, to be honest.
That's true.
Because usually you think of a king having an heir, but Gil-galad presumably didn't have children. He didn't seem to have any children that we know of. So could Elrond have claimed the kingship at this point? What do you think?
I think it was definitely a possibility, in my opinion. He was over a lot of corners also related. He was related to Turgon, the High King before Gil-galad, is the great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, of Elrond. So he's actually quite closely related to the royal line of the High Kings of the Noldor from Middle-earth. And so I think just by that, he could make a claim. And there are also not that many high-known lords left that could make a similar claim. Maybe Galadriel as kind of a ruling queen, which would be unusual, though, because I think there was never a high queen. It
would be unprecedented. There never was.
Yeah, exactly. But in theory, she would also have the line and the reputation, I guess. And I mean, Elrond was potentially also maybe involved in the War of Ras already, and he now fought in the War of the Last Alliance. Like after events like this, he for sure had a very high standing among his people. So. In my opinion, sure, he could have went for the claim. It's hard to say why he did not. If it would have been accepted is, of course, again, another story. But in theory, I see no problem with that. Why do you think Elrond did not accept this claim?
Why do I think he didn't accept it?
Not accept why he claimed.
Why didn't try to claim it? I think it's because he knows that his fate is probably going to be to sail west. Elrond is one of the most gifted in foresight of all the elves, and so I think that he knows that it's just not his place to rule over Middle-earth, that it was never his ambition anyway, and that he would one day sail west. And that he's kind of a steward for Middle-earth in a sense, rather than a king.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
Because he becomes this figure that is kind of, he's everybody's ally. He's nobody's enemy, aside from Sauron, of course. He gets on with the dwarves and he has to be kind of like an impartial free agent for people to come and for Rivendell to be a refuge for people to come to. And also, of course, it should be said in Tolkien, it's kind of a theme for those who seek out power. For that to never be wise, really. Those who seek power are the last people that should deserve to take power. In a way, so if for him to have claimed the kingship at that point, he would have had to have extended his influence. He would have had to really press the point that he was the right person to take over. And also, what structure would you invoke to actually make the decision on whether or not he was the rightful heir? There's no government system there in place for that decision to be made in a way that makes a kind of logical sense, really. Because there are other elves that you've mentioned. Galadriel, maybe even Glorfindel could make a claim to it.
Yeah, that's true.
Technically, because he was also a Noldor. We don't know his parentage, but you can speculate on that. So yeah, I don't know. There's several reasons, and I think it makes the most sense for him to not. Yeah. The meta reason is that Tolkien has this theme throughout his works that people who seek power shouldn't be the ones to hold it. We see that particularly with the White Council, I would say. Sauron wants to be in charge of the White Council, and he's the last person that should have had that job. And whereas Gandalf doesn't want the job, he doesn't even want to be in Middle Earth in a sense. He doesn't want to be there. But But he's the person that ends up leading the resistance against Sauron in the end, because he's the right person for the job.
Exactly. That is, kind of, very good point that he's kind of the steward of Middle Earth. I like that a lot. That's a very good way to put it. He is, really, and I mean, one could say, of course, we still have the Angmar story that comes up a bit later, but for a long time, Eriador is also a relatively peaceful place now. And maybe also this is, I think, the end of the Second Age with the War of the Last Alliance and the defeat of Sauron also marks slowly the elves sailing west. So it would be a kingdom that's declining anyway. So maybe it simply does not need a ruler in that sense. A strong ruler as Gil-galad.
There's not that many Noldor left to rule over, is there either? That's true. There's a bunch of them in Rivendell, and there's a few other pockets of different.
And maybe Elrond would have to move his residence over to Lindon, and probably he knew that would be a bad idea because he's needed in Rivendell.
Chris and I decided to split the podcast up into 2 parts at this point, since there is still a lot of material to discuss for this character in the Third Age. You can look forward to that second instalment dropping on the channel sometime in March.